The alarm that summoned the entire galaxy did not carry sound. It carried silence. Every major system, military grids, trade relays, diplomatic channels, paused at once, not long enough to fail, but long enough to notice. A fraction of a second where the universe seemed to hesitate, as if something essential had been removed and reality itself needed a moment to adjust. No explosion followed, no invasion fleet, no visible threat. Just that absence. Just that impossible, synchronized pause. And then the summons came. Within hours, representatives from 49 civilizations gathered in the central chamber of Halcyon Spire, a structure so vast it had once been described as a monument to permanence. Its walls shimmered with layered histories, every treaty and alliance etched into living crystal, glowing faintly with the weight of centuries. This was where civilizations came to decide what would endure. Today, they had come to decide what would be erased. At the far end of the chamber, in a section that had once required an entire delegation, a single human stood alone. No guards. No advisors. No visible concern. Ambassador Elias Vance did not look like a species on trial for its place in the galaxy. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable, his presence almost ordinary. That, more than anything, unsettled the room. Because nothing about this moment was ordinary. "You have all felt it," the presiding arbiter began, its voice resonating through the chamber without a clear source. "The disturbance. The instability. The unpredictable variables that continue to escalate." A wave of agreement moved through the assembly. Not unified, not coordinated, but aligned. For once, species that had spent centuries in cautious distance found common ground. "It is them," one representative said, not even attempting subtlety. "It has always been them." The accusation did not land like an attack. It landed like confirmation. Humans. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. Not the oldest. Not the most advanced in any measurable category. Their fleets were efficient, their science impressive, their diplomacy unconventional. But none of that explained the unease that seemed to follow them wherever they went. They solved problems too quickly. They adapted too easily. They ignored boundaries that others treated as fundamental truths. They interfere, another voice added, sharper now. They insert themselves into systems they did not build, relationships they do not understand, conflicts that are not theirs. And yet, a quieter voice interjected, those conflicts tend to end. The chamber shifted at that, but the momentum had already been decided. Doubt did not erase fear. If anything, it amplified it. They create dependencies, the arbiter continued. Not through domination, but through integration. Systems begin to rely on their presence. Processes adjust around them. Variables stabilize, until they do not. Until that pause. That impossible, universal hesitation. All eyes turned to the human. Elias Vance did not rush to speak. He let the silence stretch, not as defiance, but as if he were measuring something invisible, something only he could perceive. When he finally moved, it was not to argue. It was to nod. "You're right," he said calmly. The reaction was immediate, but not loud. It was confusion that rippled through the chamber, sharper than outrage would have been. This was not the script anyone had prepared for. "We are incompatible," Vance continued, his tone steady, almost thoughtful. "Not because we disrupt your systems, but because your systems were never meant to include something like us in the first place." "That is not an admission," one delegate snapped. "That is evasion." "No," Vance replied, meeting the gaze without resistance. "It's agreement." He did not defend humanity. He did not list contributions or alliances or victories. He did not remind them of the countless crises where human intervention had turned failure into survival. All of that remained unspoken, hanging in the air like a truth no one wanted to examine too closely. Instead, he offered them something far more unsettling: compliance. "If the consensus is that the galaxy functions better without us," he said, "then we will remove ourselves." The chamber froze again, but this time it wasn't systems. It was expectation. "You will contest nothing?" the arbiter asked. "There is nothing to contest," Vance said. "You've already decided what we are." And your response is to accept exile, another voice pressed. Our response, Vance corrected gently, is to respect your choice. It was too easy. That was the problem. Species that had prepared for resistance, for negotiation, even for conflict, found themselves with nothing to push against. No friction. No struggle. Just a door being quietly opened from the other side. The withdrawal period will be 30 standard cycles, the Arbiter declared, recovering control of the proceedings. All human presence must be removed from Council-aligned space. All shared systems will be recalibrated. All dependencies will be. 7 days, Vance said. The interruption was soft, but it cut through the chamber with surgical precision. Clarify, the Arbiter demanded. We'll be gone in 7 days, Vance repeated. No extensions. No residual infrastructure. No transitional overlap. That is unnecessary, someone said, though the uncertainty in their voice betrayed them. Such rapid disengagement could destabilize existing networks. For the first time, something flickered in the human's expression. Not anger. Not pride. Something closer to curiosity. Yes, Vance said quietly. It could. The chamber did not like the way he said that. You will proceed according to the Council's timeline, the Arbiter insisted. Vance considered that for a moment, as if weighing not the command, but its consequences. Of course, he said. But something in the room shifted anyway. Because he didn't sound like someone agreeing. He sounded like someone humoring them. The vote that followed was almost ceremonial. The outcome had been decided long before anyone entered the chamber. One by one, civilizations cast their decisions into the record, their justifications echoing variations of the same conclusion. Humans were unpredictable. Humans were disruptive. Humans were unnecessary. When the final count was announced, it carried the weight of certainty. This was not a divided decision. It was a unified one. Humanity was to be removed. Elias Vance listened without reaction. When it was done, he simply inclined his head, as if acknowledging a well-executed formality. No protest. No final plea. No attempt to change what had already been set in motion. He gathered nothing. There were no documents, no devices, no visible traces of preparation. Just a man, standing in a place that had decided it no longer needed him. Ambassador, the Arbiter called as he turned to leave. Do you have any final statement for the record? Vance paused at the threshold, one hand resting lightly against the doorway as he looked back at the assembly that had just voted his entire species out of existence within their shared civilization. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something profound. Something memorable. Something that would be recorded alongside the great turning points of galactic history. Instead, he smiled. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't bitter. It was understanding. You won't notice it immediately, he said. That's the part most of you will find comforting. A faint ripple of irritation moved through the chamber. Notice what? Someone demanded. Vance's gaze moved across them, not as opponents, but as variables in an equation already solved. The difference, he said. He stepped through the doorway. And by the time you do, he added softly, almost as an afterthought, you won't remember how it used to work. The door closed behind him. For a long moment, nothing happened. No alarms. No failures. No visible consequences. Just a chamber full of civilizations, convinced they had just secured their future. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of their sensors, something that had always been quietly holding everything together, began to let go. For the first 12 hours after the vote, nothing broke. That was the first sign something was wrong. Across Council space, systems continued exactly as they always had. Trade routes remained active, fleets maintained formation, communication networks relayed data without interruption. On every measurable level, the galaxy functioned perfectly. Efficient. Stable. Predictable. The Council took this as confirmation. In the upper chambers of Halcyon Spire, emergency oversight committees dissolved almost as quickly as they had formed. The disturbance that had triggered the summit, the brief, inexplicable pause across every major system, was quietly reclassified as a transient anomaly. A statistical irregularity. Something to be studied later, perhaps, but no longer urgent. After all, the cause had been identified and removed. "Observe," the arbiter stated during the first post-decision review, its tone carrying a subtle note of satisfaction. "No further disruptions. No cascading instability. The network remains intact." Several representatives signaled agreement, their confidence returning with each passing minute of normalcy. "They were overstated," one delegate remarked. "Their impact exaggerated by proximity. Remove the variable, remove the distortion." "And yet," another voice added carefully, "the initial disturbance—" "A coincidence," the arbiter interrupted smoothly. "Correlation does not imply causation. We acted based on long-term behavioral patterns, not a single event." No one challenged that. Not directly. Because it sounded reasonable. Because it felt correct. And because nothing had gone wrong. Far from the spire, on a trading station orbiting a binary star system, a minor scheduling delay occurred. It was so small it barely registered. Two cargo vessels, one from a methane-breathing consortium, the other from a silicon-based guild, requested docking access within the same time window. Normally, this would have been resolved instantly. Their environmental requirements were incompatible, their unloading procedures mutually exclusive, but the station's coordination systems had handled such conflicts thousands of times before. This time, the system hesitated. Not visibly. Not in a way that triggered alarms. It simply took longer. A fraction of a second stretched into 2. 2 into 5. By the time the docking assignments were finalized, both captains had already transmitted formal complaints. Each accused the other of attempting to manipulate priority access. Each demanded clarification, then compensation, then acknowledgement of fault. The station's overseer attempted to mediate. It followed protocol precisely. It quoted regulations, referenced precedent, calculated optimal outcomes. Neither side accepted the resolution. That, in itself, was not unusual. Disputes happened. Misunderstandings occurred. The system flagged it, recorded it, and moved on. But something subtle had changed. There was no one to smooth it over. No quiet adjustment. No unseen recalibration. No voice stepping in to translate not just the words, but the intent behind them. The system had delivered a correct answer. It just hadn't delivered the right one. Elsewhere, on a medical research platform deep within Council space, a team of specialists reviewed the results of a routine procedure. The data was flawless. Every variable had been accounted for. Every calculation precise. The treatment had been executed exactly as designed, following protocols refined over decades of cross-species collaboration. And yet, the patient's condition had not improved. Rerun the analysis, the lead researcher instructed, though there was no real expectation of error. The results came back identical. Perfect. And ineffective. "It should have worked," one of the assistants said quietly, as if lowering their voice might reveal something the data had missed. "It did work," another replied, gesturing at the readouts. "The procedure was successful. Then why isn't the patient stabilizing?" No one had an answer. Because the answer wasn't in the data. Not anymore. In the defense sectors along the outer rim, a patrol fleet adjusted its formation in response to a routine sensor ping. The signal indicated a potential anomaly, nothing urgent, nothing confirmed, but standard procedure dictated investigation. The fleet moved with precision. Angles calculated. Distances optimized. Response times within acceptable thresholds. And yet, something about the maneuver felt slower. Not in speed, but in decision. Each step followed the last exactly as it should, but there was a faint delay between them, like a thought that needed to be consciously completed instead of instinctively understood. The anomaly resolved itself before they arrived. Another false alarm. Another entry in the logs. Another moment that should have meant nothing. Back on Halcyon Spire, reports of these minor irregularities began to accumulate. Individually, they were insignificant. A delay here. A disagreement there. A procedure that required repetition instead of immediate success. None of it rose to the level of concern. Not yet. These are expected fluctuations, the arbiter concluded during the second review session. Any large-scale adjustment introduces temporary inefficiencies. The system will recalibrate. But the patterns are consistent, one representative noted. Small delays across multiple sectors. Increased conflict resolution times. A slight degradation in. Inconsequential, another interrupted. We are observing noise, not signal. The phrase settled the discussion. Noise, not signal. It was comforting. It meant nothing fundamental had changed. It meant the foundation was still solid. It meant the decision had been correct. And so the Council did what it had always done when faced with uncertainty. It trusted its systems. It trusted its data. It trusted the structures that had carried it through centuries of cooperation and conflict. What it did not consider, what it did not even know how to measure, was the absence of something that had never been formally defined. Something that had never been logged, never been quantified, never been required. Because it had always been there. Until now. On the 7th hour after the vote, a message was quietly transmitted from the outer edge of Council space. It was not addressed to the Council. It was not routed through official channels. It did not request acknowledgement. It simply existed, moving through the network like a ghost signal, bypassing protocols that no longer recognized it. For a brief moment, one of the monitoring systems detected it, flagged it, attempted to classify it, and then, lacking the necessary parameters, allowed it to pass. No one noticed, except for one analyst, deep within a secondary observation node, who caught a fragment of the transmission before it disappeared beyond traceable space. Just a few words. Not a warning. Not a threat. More like a timestamp. Day 1, the message read. The analyst frowned, replaying the fragment, searching for context that wasn't there. Day 1 of what? There was no follow-up. No additional data. No indication of origin. Just those two words, hanging in the system like the beginning of something that hadn't revealed itself yet. And for reasons the analyst couldn't explain, that felt far more unsettling than any alarm could have been. By the second day, the word delay had quietly entered reports across the galaxy. Not failure. Not collapse. Just delay. It appeared in places that had never needed such a word before. Systems that had operated with seamless precision now required clarification, confirmation, repetition. Nothing catastrophic, nothing visible to the average observer, but to those who worked within the machinery of civilization, the difference was unmistakable. Things were taking longer. Not because they were broken. Because they no longer understood each other. On the diplomatic station orbiting a neutral star, two delegations sat across from one another, locked in a negotiation that should have taken minutes. Their translators were flawless, their data complete, their positions clearly defined. Every statement was processed, interpreted, and delivered without error. And yet, neither side could agree on what was being said. You are altering the terms, one representative insisted, their tone sharpening with each exchange. We are restating them, the other replied. Your interpretation is inaccurate. Our interpretation is based on your last transmission. That transmission was clarified. It was contradicted. It was refined. It was changed. The conversation looped, escalating not in complexity, but in frustration. Each side believed they were being precise. Each believed the other was being deliberately difficult. The system flagged the negotiation as active, functional, and progressing. It was wrong. No one was resolving anything. And for the first time in centuries, there was no one in the room who could step in and say, "That's not what they meant." Elsewhere, in the core research sectors, a team of physicists stood in front of a model that had once redefined their understanding of faster-than-light travel. The equations were intact. Every variable accounted for, every principle documented. The model had been tested, verified, and applied across dozens of systems. It was not experimental. It was foundational. And yet, when they attempted to expand it, just a minor adjustment, a slight extension of an existing theory, the results collapsed into nonsense. Check the assumptions, the lead scientist ordered. We did, an assistant replied. They're consistent. Then check the derivation. Also consistent. Then why doesn't it work? No one answered. Because the question had already been asked. Across multiple labs. across multiple disciplines. The same pattern repeated, knowledge that functioned perfectly within its original boundaries, but refused to evolve beyond them. It was as if the science itself had been paused, not broken, just unable to move forward. In the medical sectors, the pattern deepened. Procedures that had once adapted fluidly to different species now required strict adherence to protocol. Variations that had previously improved outcomes were no longer being considered, not because they were forbidden, but because no one thought to apply them. A surgeon paused mid-operation, reviewing a set of instructions that were technically correct and yet incomplete. "There should be an adjustment here," they murmured. "For what?" their assistant asked. "For I don't know." That was the problem. They didn't know what they didn't know, and so they followed the protocol exactly. The patient survived, but the recovery did not go as expected. In the outer defense grid, something more dangerous began to emerge. A series of sensor readings, subtle, intermittent, started appearing along the edges of monitored space. Individually, they were dismissed as noise, background interference, the kind of data fluctuation that had always existed at the limits of detection. But there was a pattern, not in the readings themselves, in the way they were being ignored. Before, such anomalies would have triggered curiosity. A closer look, a second opinion. Someone, somewhere, would have asked, "What if this isn't noise?" Now, the system processed the data, categorized it, and moved on. Efficient. Correct. Blind. On Halcyon Spire, the accumulation of these inconsistencies began to strain the Council's confidence. Not openly, not in a way that would suggest doubt, but in the questions that were starting to be asked behind closed channels, in the subtle shift of tone during briefings, in the way representatives began to review reports more than once before dismissing them. "These are not isolated incidents," one analyst stated during a restricted session, projecting a series of overlapping data streams. "We are observing a consistent increase in processing delays, conflict escalation, and procedural rigidity across multiple sectors." Within acceptable margins, another countered quickly. "Individually, yes. Collectively," the analyst hesitated. "Collectively, they suggest a systemic change." "A change we anticipated," the arbiter replied. "The removal of any major variable requires recalibration. This does not feel like recalibration." "Define feel." The analyst fell silent, because that was the problem. There was no metric for what was missing, no data point labeled intuition, no system variable for understanding, no recorded function for the subtle, invisible adjustments that had once smoothed every interaction, bridged every gap, resolved every misunderstanding before it became conflict. Those things had never been part of the system. And yet, without them, the system was starting to fray. The message appeared again 12 hours later. Not in the same place, not through the same channel, but with the same quiet precision. Day 2. This time, it was detected by 3 separate monitoring nodes. Flagged, cross-referenced, and again, ultimately dismissed. No origin, no context, no identifiable purpose. Just 2 words. And yet, for the few who saw it, the message carried a weight that none of the official reports did. Because, unlike the data, it implied intention. Someone was counting. Someone who knew exactly what was happening. And was waiting. By the 3rd day, the delays were no longer invisible. They were beginning to accumulate. Not enough to trigger panic. Not enough to justify alarm. But enough that, for the first time since the vote, a question began to form, not in whispers, not in private channels, but in the shared awareness of those responsible for holding the galaxy together. What, exactly, had they removed? And more importantly, why did it feel like everything had been depending on it? By the 4th day, the word delay was no longer used. It had been replaced by something far more dangerous. Dispute. Across council space, systems were still functioning, but the harmony between them had begun to fracture in ways no algorithm could repair. Agreements that had held for centuries were suddenly open to interpretation. Contracts once considered absolute were now challenged, re-examined, and, most critically, rejected. Not because they were invalid, Because no one could agree on what they meant anymore. On the industrial world of Kethra 9, a production line the size of a continent ground to a halt. Massive fabrication arrays stood silent, their processes frozen mid-cycle as shipments failed to arrive, not due to lack of supply, but because transport guilds refused to deliver under unclear terms. "We fulfilled our obligations," one representative insisted through a strained transmission. "Your failure to accept delivery is not our responsibility." "You altered the delivery window," came the reply. "Your interpretation violates the agreement. It follows the original clause." That clause was amended. "By mutual understanding. We did not agree. You did not object. Because we did not recognize the change as valid." The argument spiraled, looping endlessly, each side citing data that was technically correct and functionally useless. Before, such disputes never reached this stage. Before, someone would have stepped in, not to enforce rules, but to align perspectives, to reinterpret the intent behind the agreement, to find the narrow space where both sides could walk away satisfied. Now, there was only the rule. And the rule, it turned out, was not enough. Production on Kethra 9 dropped to 0 within hours. In the scientific sectors, the situation deteriorated further. Entire research divisions began reporting a phenomenon they could not quantify: stagnation. Not failure, progress had simply stopped. Projects that required interdisciplinary collaboration became impossible as teams struggled to synchronize their methodologies. "What do you mean the model is incompatible?" a senior researcher demanded, staring at a data stream that should have integrated seamlessly. "It meets all structural requirements," the assistant replied. "But it does not align with their interpretive framework." "That is not a scientific limitation. That is a communication issue." "Yes," the assistant said quietly. "And we cannot resolve it. Because the problem was no longer about knowledge. It was about understanding. And understanding, they were beginning to realize, had never been as universal as they believed. In the defense networks, the consequences were no longer subtle. A coordinated response drill, routine, predictable, executed hundreds of times before, failed for the first time in recorded history. Not catastrophically, but enough. Fleet A responded to a simulated threat based on its interpretation of priority protocols. Fleet B interpreted the same protocols differently, arriving late and in the wrong formation. Fleet C, attempting to compensate, overcorrected and created a vulnerability in the defensive grid. Individually, each action was logical. Collectively, they were disastrous. "Why are they not coordinating?" the commanding officer demanded, watching the simulation unravel in real time. "They are following protocol," the systems analyst replied. "Then the protocol is wrong. The protocol has not changed." The officer stared at the display, at the perfectly functioning systems producing a perfectly flawed outcome. "No," he said slowly. "Something else has." On Halcyon Spire, the Council could no longer ignore the pattern. Emergency sessions resumed, this time without the confidence that had defined the first. Reports flooded in from every sector: economic disruption, scientific stagnation, military inefficiencies, all linked by a common thread that no one could quite articulate. "We are experiencing a systemic degradation in interspecies cooperation," one analyst summarized, projecting a web of data points that pulsed with unresolved conflicts. Not due to resource scarcity or external interference, but due to an increase in interpretive divergence. "Speak plainly," a delegate snapped. "We cannot agree on what we mean anymore." The chamber fell silent. Because that was not a problem they knew how to solve. "Implement stricter protocols," another representative suggested quickly. "Standardize communication. Remove ambiguity." "We have," the analyst replied. "It has increased the rate of disputes." "Then enforce compliance." "With what authority?" another voice countered. "Every enforcement action is now being challenged under conflicting interpretations of jurisdiction." The discussion fractured almost immediately, each proposal generating more disagreement than resolution. Voices overlapped, arguments escalated, and for the first time in centuries, the Council itself began to mirror the instability it was meant to control. At the center of it all, the arbiter remained silent. Not because it lacked answers, but because, for the first time, it lacked certainty. The message arrived again. Day 4. This time, it was impossible to ignore. It appeared simultaneously across multiple systems, trade networks, research databases, even restricted military channels, bypassing security protocols with an ease that should not have been possible. Trace it, the arbiter ordered immediately. Analysts scrambled, isolating the signal, mapping its path, attempting to identify its origin. They found nothing. No source. No transmission trail. No point of entry. It was as if the message had simply existed. "What does it mean?" one representative demanded, their composure finally beginning to crack. No one answered, because the implication was becoming harder to dismiss. Someone was tracking the passage of time. Not in hours or cycles, but in days. Days since the removal. Days since the change. Days since something fundamental had been taken out of the system. And as the Council watched their civilization strain under pressures they could neither predict nor control, a question began to surface, not as a theory, not as a hypothesis, but as a quiet, growing certainty. What if this wasn't instability? What if this was the system, returning to what it had always been without them? The thought settled over the chamber like a shadow. Unwelcome, uncomfortable, and impossible to dismiss. Because if it was true, then the problem was not something that could be fixed with better protocols or stricter rules. It was something far worse. Something they had never accounted for. Something they had never even realized they needed. And somewhere beyond their reach, beyond their sensors, beyond the systems that were slowly unraveling without understanding why. Humanity was already gone. By the 5th day, the Council stopped asking how to fix the problem. They started asking what the problem actually was. For centuries, the galaxy had believed it understood itself. Its systems were documented, its processes refined, its cooperation engineered through layers of protocol and logic. Every interaction had a rule. Every outcome had a calculation. It was not perfect, but it was predictable. Until now. Because what they were facing no longer behaved like a system failure. It behaved like something missing. The realization did not come from the Council. It came from someone they had already dismissed. Deep within a secondary analysis node, far from the central chambers, far from authority, a junior systems observer named Relvex sat surrounded by fragments of data that refused to align. He was not a strategist, not a leader, not someone whose conclusions would normally reach the Council floor. Which was precisely why he saw it. He was not trying to prove anything. He was just trying to understand why nothing made sense anymore. The patterns were there, buried beneath layers of noise. Trade disputes, scientific stagnation, military misalignment, they looked unrelated, but when mapped together, they revealed something far more unsettling. Every failure point occurred at the boundary between systems, not within them. The systems themselves were intact, perfectly functional, but the connections between them were failing. Relvek leaned back slowly, staring at the web of data as a single thought began to form. "This isn't a breakdown," he murmured. "It's a separation." He expanded the model, overlaying historical data from before the vote, years, decades, centuries of interactions. The difference was immediate and impossible to ignore. Before, those same boundaries had existed. Species with incompatible biology. Technologies built on fundamentally different principles. Cultural frameworks that should have made cooperation impossible. And yet, they had worked. Not flawlessly, but consistently. Because something had always been there, bridging the gaps. Not a system. Not a protocol. Something else. Relvek's hands moved quickly now, pulling archived records, isolating variables, stripping away everything that could be quantified. What remained was frustratingly vague, scattered across countless interactions with no formal designation. A pattern without a name. He cross-referenced it with one final dataset. Human involvement. The result hit him like a physical force. Every successful cross-system interaction, every resolved dispute, every scientific breakthrough, every coordinated defense response, contained one common factor. Not human authority. Not human control. Human presence. They weren't leading the system. They were connecting it. Relvek stared at the conclusion, his mind racing to reject it, to find a flaw, a miscalculation, anything that would make it less absurd. But the data did not lie. The galaxy had not been stable because its systems were perfect. It had been stable because something imperfect had been constantly adjusting them. Quietly, continuously, unrecorded. Humans, he whispered, the word carrying a weight it had never held before. Not disruptors. Not variables. Not even participants. They had been something far more fundamental. A compatibility layer. Not in the technical sense. In the human sense. They translated more than language. They interpreted intent. They adapted protocols without rewriting them. They bent rigid systems just enough to make them work together without breaking them. They saw contradictions and didn't reject them, they worked around them. And most dangerously of all, they made it look effortless. Relvek's breath caught as the final implication settled in. The galaxy had never been stable. It had been maintained, artificially, by a species that had never been recognized as essential. He didn't hesitate. He transmitted the findings directly to the Council, bypassing standard channels, ignoring protocol. For the first time in his career, he chose speed over procedure. Because if he was right, they weren't dealing with a temporary disruption. They were watching the illusion collapse. On Halcyon Spire, the report arrived in the middle of another fractured session. Arguments had devolved into overlapping accusations, proposals collapsing under their own contradictions before they could even be considered. The Arbiter paused the chamber as the data streamed across the central display. At first, the reaction was confusion. Then resistance. Then silence. "This is speculation," one delegate said quickly, though their voice lacked conviction. "Correlation does not imply." "It aligns across all sectors," another interrupted, scanning the data with growing unease. "Trade, science, defense, diplomacy, every failure occurs at points of interconnection. And those points," the Arbiter said slowly, "were consistently influenced by human activity." "Not controlled," Relvek's voice cut in through the transmission, sharper than expected. "Influenced. Adjusted. Interpreted." "You are suggesting," a representative said carefully, "that our entire civilization depended on informal human intervention?" "I am suggesting," Relvek replied, "that without them, our systems are behaving exactly as they were designed to." The words hung in the chamber like a verdict. Cold. Precise. Damning. "That is impossible," someone whispered. "No," the Arbiter said quietly, its tone shifting for the first time since the crisis began. "It is not. Because the evidence was undeniable. Every system was functioning correctly. Every protocol was being followed. Every rule was being applied exactly as intended. And everything was still falling apart. Not because something was broken. Because nothing was being adjusted anymore." The realization spread through the chamber, not as panic, but as something far worse. Understanding. They had not removed a problem. They had removed the only thing that made their solution work. "They created this," one delegate said, almost in disbelief. "This entire structure, this cooperation, it only exists because of them." "No," the Arbiter corrected softly. "They sustained it." A deeper silence followed. Because sustaining something was far more dangerous than creating it. Creation implied ownership. Sustaining implied dependency. And dependency could not be undone. The message appeared again. Not in the systems. Not in the networks. But directly on the central display of the council chamber. No signal. No transmission. Just two words, forming in light that should not have been there. Day 5. This time, no one dismissed it. No one questioned its origin. Because for the first time, they understood what it represented. A countdown. Not to collapse. To realization. And as the truth settled into every mind within the chamber, that their civilization had been balanced on something they had never seen, never measured, never valued. A far more terrifying question began to take shape. If humans had been holding everything together, what else had they been holding back? By the 6th day, the galaxy stopped pretending it was stable. The collapse was no longer theoretical, no longer buried beneath data anomalies and analytical debates. It had moved into the physical world, into empty ports, silent factories, fractured fleets, and skies that no longer felt secure. Trade did not slow. It stopped. Across thousands of systems, docking bays stood open and unused, their schedules filled with conflicts that no one could resolve. Cargo ships hovered in orbit, waiting for permissions that never aligned, caught between contracts that were technically valid and functionally impossible. Entire supply chains, once seamless, invisible arteries of civilization, choked under the weight of disagreement. "Authorize override," a station commander demanded, watching his operations grid freeze under a cascade of unresolved requests. "I cannot," his systems officer replied. "Every override triggers a counterclaim under jurisdictional conflict. We do not have authority to enforce a resolution." "Then escalate." We did. It escalated into a dispute between three governing bodies. Then who decides? The silence that followed was the answer. No one did. Elsewhere, the scientific sectors reached a breaking point. For days, researchers had tried to push forward, to adapt, to compensate for the growing disconnect in their work. But science, they were discovering, did not collapse with explosions or alarms. It simply stopped moving. On the core research world of Talvin Prime, an entire division shut down within a single rotation. Not because of failure, but because progress had become impossible. "We have the equations," one scientist said, her voice hollow as she stared at a display that once represented the cutting edge of galactic knowledge. "We have the models. We have the tools." "Then why aren't we advancing?" another demanded. "Because we don't understand why they work." The realization rippled through the lab like a shockwave. For decades, they had believed they were building upon a shared foundation of knowledge, expanding it, refining it, evolving it. Now they saw the truth. They had been standing on something they didn't fully comprehend. Something human. Without it, their work wasn't failing. It was incomplete. In the defense sectors, the consequences were far more immediate. The first confirmed breach came without warning. A border system, previously considered low risk, well within monitored space, went dark. Not due to internal failure, but external incursion. By the time the nearest fleet responded, the threat had already moved on, leaving behind a system stripped of resources and communications. "How did we miss this?" Admiral Kareth demanded, his voice cutting through the command center like a blade. "Our sensors detected anomalous readings," an officer replied, struggling to maintain composure. "They were classified as non-critical fluctuations." "By who?" "By the system." "Then the system is wrong." "The system is functioning as designed." Kareth stared at the tactical display, at the expanding zones of uncertainty spreading across the outer rim like a slow infection. "That's the problem," he said. "Because the system wasn't failing. It was doing exactly what it had always done. It just wasn't being watched anymore. Not the way it used to be." More reports followed. Multiple incursions. Uncoordinated responses. Fleets arriving too late, or in the wrong configuration, or not at all because their orders conflicted with another interpretation of priority. Each mistake small. Each delay explainable. Together, catastrophic. On Halcyon Spire, the council chamber had transformed. The order that once defined it had dissolved into controlled chaos. Representatives no longer spoke in measured tones. They argued, interrupted, contradicted one another openly. The illusion of unified governance had shattered under the weight of its own limitations. "This is unsustainable," one delegate snapped. "We are losing control of multiple sectors simultaneously." "Then impose centralized authority," another countered. "Override regional autonomy and enforce uniform protocols. That will escalate conflicts further. We have already seen. We have seen what happens when we do nothing. And what happens when we act without understanding." The argument spiraled, each side correct in isolation, each incapable of aligning with the other. At the center of it all, the arbiter remained silent. Not out of indecision. Out of recognition. Because for the first time, it understood the nature of the problem. This was not a failure of systems. It was a failure of connection. And connection could not be forced. "Status of external threats," the arbiter finally asked, cutting through the noise. The chamber quieted, Not out of respect, but out of necessity. All border sectors report increased activity, an analyst responded, projecting a map that pulsed with expanding zones of uncertainty. Previously contained entities are probing deeper into council space. Their movements are coordinated, though their origin remains unclear. Why now? A representative demanded. The analyst hesitated, then answered the question no one wanted to ask. Because we are visible now. A chill moved through the chamber. For centuries, the galaxy had believed its defenses were strong, its surveillance comprehensive, its response capabilities unmatched. Now they were beginning to understand. They had not been invisible because they were powerful. They had been invisible because someone had been watching the dark for them. Someone who noticed patterns others dismissed. Someone who acted before threats became visible. Someone who didn't wait for confirmation. Humans. They knew, one delegate whispered. They knew this would happen. The message appeared again. Not as a disruption. Not as an intrusion. As a presence. Day 6. This time, it was accompanied by something new. Coordinates. A single point in space, far beyond the mapped boundaries of Council territory. No explanation. No context. Just a location. What is this? Someone asked, though the answer was already forming. The arbiter studied the coordinates, processing data that should not have been accessible, cross-referencing star charts that did not officially exist within Council records. And then it understood. This is where they went, it said quietly. A ripple of realization spread through the chamber. They left, together, another voice added, connecting the reports of non-human departures, the missing fleets, the silent exodus that had gone largely unnoticed in the chaos. Not just humans. Everyone who had chosen them. They didn't retreat, the arbiter continued, its tone shifting into something colder, sharper. They relocated. To what? A delegate asked. No one answered. Because the question was wrong. The correct question, the one that settled over the chamber like an approaching storm, was far more dangerous. What had they built? Because if humanity had been the invisible force holding the galaxy together, then whatever they were building now was being built without them. By the 7th day, the word collapse was no longer debated. It was documented. Entire sectors had gone silent, not from destruction, but from disconnection. Trade networks no longer functioned, research hubs stood abandoned, and defense grids operated in fragmented isolation, each system protecting itself without coordination, without awareness of the greater whole. Civilization had not fallen. It had separated. On Halcyon Spire, the council chamber was half empty. Not because representatives had chosen to leave, but because they could no longer arrive. Transport conflicts, jurisdictional disputes, and navigation inconsistencies had turned even the act of gathering into an unsolvable problem. Those who remained sat in uneasy silence, surrounded by the echo of a structure that no longer held itself together. For the first time in its recorded existence, the council was no longer a unified body. It was just a room. "We are out of time," one of the remaining delegates said, their voice stripped of the authority it once carried. "Whatever this is, it is accelerating." "Not accelerating," the arbiter replied quietly. "Unfolding." The distinction mattered, because acceleration implied escalation. Unfolding implied inevitability. A series of reports streamed across the chamber's central display, each one more severe than the last. Border systems lost. Core infrastructure failing. Independent regions declaring isolation, refusing to engage with external entities they could no longer understand or trust. And beneath it all, the same pattern. Every failure occurred where connection was required. Every breakdown emerged where understanding had once bridged difference. They were the bridge, someone said, not as a theory, but as a realization too late to matter. And we removed it, another added. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue. The decision had been made. The consequences were unfolding. And for the first time, the Council understood the scale of what they had lost. Not a species. A function. A role so fundamental it had never been recognized as one. "They won't come back," a delegate said, the words heavy with something that resembled fear. Why would they? The question hung unanswered. Because the answer was obvious. They had not been asked to leave. They had been told. Unanimously. Without hesitation. Without doubt. And now, the same voices that had declared them unnecessary were searching for a way to reverse something that no longer belonged to them. "Send the message," the Arbiter said. The chamber turned toward it, startled by the sudden clarity in its tone. "On what terms?" someone asked. The Arbiter paused, processing a reality it had never been designed to confront. "There are no terms," it said. That, more than anything, silenced the room. Because terms implied negotiation. And negotiation required leverage. They had none. "Then what do we offer?" another voice pressed. The Arbiter did not answer immediately. Because for the first time, it had to consider something outside of protocol. Outside of logic. Outside of the systems it had always trusted. "We offer acknowledgement," it said finally. "Of what?" The Arbiter's response was simple. "Of the truth." The transmission was prepared quickly, stripped of authority, stripped of demands, stripped of everything that had once defined Council communication. It was not a command. Not a proposal. It was a request. A recognition. A message sent into the unknown coordinates that had appeared alongside the now familiar marker of time. Day 7. For a long moment after the transmission was sent, nothing happened. No confirmation. No response. Just silence. And then, slowly, the central display flickered. Not with incoming data. With interruption. The chamber lights dimmed, not failing, but yielding, as the system's control shifted to something that did not ask permission. The same phenomenon that had carried the previous messages now manifested fully, not as text, but as presence. A channel opened. Not routed through the Council's network. Not bound by its protocols. Something else. And within it, a figure appeared. Not projected. Not transmitted. Present in a way that defied classification. Human. Elias Vance. But not the ambassador who had stood before them days ago. The uniform was different. The posture sharper. The stillness more deliberate. And behind him, movement. Not chaos. Not randomness. Structure. Ships, thousands of them, moved in coordinated patterns that flowed like a single organism. Not identical, not uniform, but aligned in a way that transcended standard formation logic. Around them, structures unlike anything in Council space expanded outward, adaptive, evolving, responding to one another in real time. It was not a fleet. It was a system. Alive in a way the Council had never seen before. "You found us faster than expected," Vance said, his voice carrying none of the tension that filled the chamber. "That's encouraging." No one spoke. Because every instinct in the room was trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they understood. And failing. "What is this?" a delegate finally asked, their voice barely steady. Vance glanced back, as if considering the question. "This," he said. "This is what happens when nothing is lost in translation." The words landed harder than any accusation. "You left," another voice said, sharper now, almost desperate. "You abandoned the systems you were part of. You destabilized." "No," Vance interrupted, not harshly, but with absolute certainty. "We removed ourselves. Your systems are behaving exactly as they were designed to." The same phrase. The same truth. Now impossible to deny. "We need your assistance," the Arbiter said, its tone stripped of authority, reduced to something closer to necessity. "Our civilization is failing." Vance studied them for a moment. Not with judgment. With recognition. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." The simplicity of it cut deeper than any condemnation. "Then help us," someone said, the words breaking free before they could be restrained. "You know how to fix this. You've already proven." "Fix it," Vance repeated, as if testing the idea. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Something more complicated. "You still think this is a problem you can solve by restoring what was there before," he said. "Isn't it?" the Arbiter asked. The question hung in the space between them. And for the first time since the connection opened, Vance did not answer immediately. Because the truth, when it came, would not just end the conversation. It would redefine it. Behind him, the vast living structure of humanity's new creation continued to move, fluid, adaptive, impossibly synchronized. A system that did not need to be corrected, because it had never been broken. "You're asking the wrong question," Vance said finally. The chamber leaned forward, as one. "Then what is the right one?" the Arbiter asked. Vance's gaze sharpened, not with hostility, but with something far more final. "Not how to fix your civilization," he said, "but why you thought it ever worked without us." The silence that followed was absolute, because for the first time, they didn't have an answer. And somewhere in that realization, something inside the council finally broke. No one in the chamber spoke. Not because they had nothing to say, because for the first time in their existence, they had nothing left that mattered. The realization did not arrive like a shock. It settled slowly, heavily, pressing into every mind at once. The systems they had trusted, the logic they had built their civilization on, the certainty that structure alone was enough. All of it had been incomplete. Not wrong. Just insufficient. "You built something new," the Arbiter said at last, its voice quieter than it had ever been, stripped of command, stripped of certainty. "Something that does not require what we lost." Vance did not nod. He did not deny it either. "We built something that doesn't ignore what we are," he replied. Behind him, the vast network of human-aligned systems continued to shift and adapt in real time. Ships adjusted course without issuing commands. Structures expanded and reconfigured without central coordination. Different species, clearly visible now, moved within that system not as separate entities, but as parts of something larger. Not identical. Not controlled. Connected. And most unsettling of all, effortlessly. "You integrated them," a delegate said, staring at the non-human vessels moving in perfect alignment with human constructs. "Other species, they're working with you." "They're working with each other," Vance corrected. "We just don't force them to pretend they're the same." The chamber tightened around that statement, because that had been the foundation of everything they built. Standardization. Uniformity. The belief that stability came from forcing differences into a single, consistent structure. And now they were staring at something that had achieved stability without erasing those differences. "How?" someone demanded, the word breaking free with a desperation that no longer tried to hide itself. "How are you doing this without the protocols? Without the systems we spent centuries refining?" Vance considered them for a moment, as if deciding how much truth they were ready to hear. "We didn't remove your systems," he said. "We stopped pretending they were enough." The answer did not satisfy them. Because it wasn't meant to. "You're describing something intangible," the Arbiter said, attempting to regain a foothold in logic. "Something that cannot be codified, cannot be enforced, cannot be scaled." "Yes," Vance said. "And yet you built an entire civilization on it." "Yes." The simplicity of the exchange made it worse. "Then explain it," another voice pressed. "Explain what we are missing." Vance's expression shifted again, not into something softer, but something more precise. "You're not missing anything," he said. The chamber stilled. "You removed it," he added. That landed differently. Because missing implied absence. Removed implied choice. "You had it," Vance continued. "Every time one of your systems worked despite its limitations, every time two incompatible species reached an agreement, every time a problem resolved faster than your models predicted, you had it." The chamber filled with fragments of memory, moments that had once seemed insignificant. A negotiation that concluded too quickly. A scientific breakthrough that didn't follow expected patterns. A military response that felt instinctive. At the time, they had attributed it to efficiency, to optimization, to the strength of their systems. They had never looked closer. "Humans were there," someone whispered. "Not always," Vance said. "But often enough to make you think it was normal." The truth unfolded in layers, each one more unsettling than the last. It had never been normal. It had been maintained. "You adapted us out," Vance said, his voice calm, but final. "You built systems that didn't need to understand, only to function. And as long as we were there, quietly adjusting the edges, it worked. And now? The Arbiter asked, though it already knew the answer. Now it's just your system, Vance replied. The weight of that settled over the chamber like gravity, because their system was exactly what they had designed it to be. Precise, logical, unyielding, and completely incapable of holding itself together. Silence stretched, not as hesitation, but as acceptance. For the first time, there was no argument, no counterpoint, no attempt to reinterpret the situation into something manageable. There was only truth, and the consequences of ignoring it. We were wrong, the Arbiter said. It was not a statement made lightly. It was not made for effect. It was simply accurate. Yes, Vance said. No hesitation. No softening. Just acknowledgement. We cannot restore what we had, the Arbiter continued. We cannot rebuild it without you. This time, Vance did not answer immediately, because this was the moment that mattered. Not for them. For him. For everything humanity had become beyond their reach. You can't rebuild it the way it was, he said finally. Hope flickered in the chamber, fragile, desperate, immediate. But you can build something else, he added. The hope faltered. Not by recreating us, Vance continued. Not by forcing your systems to compensate for what you don't understand, but by accepting that what held everything together was never the structure. The chamber leaned into the words, searching for something they could use, something they could implement, something they could turn into process. They were still trying to solve it. Still trying to reduce it to something manageable. Vance saw that, and for the first time, he shook his head. It wasn't the rules, he said. It wasn't the protocols. It wasn't even the systems. He paused, letting the truth settle before he said the part they would struggle to accept. It was the choice. The chamber stilled. Choice to adapt. Choice to understand. Choice to adjust without being told to. Choice to care whether the other side actually understands you. None of those things could be enforced. None of them could be calculated. And that was the problem. You built a civilization that doesn't require that choice, Vance said. And as long as it didn't have to, it survived. The implication was clear. Now, it didn't. A long silence followed. Not empty. Full. Because for the first time, they were not thinking about how to fix the system. They were thinking about what kind of civilization they had built, and whether they were capable of becoming something else. We cannot ask you to return, the Arbiter said at last. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was understanding. Vance inclined his head slightly. No, he said. Another silence. Softer this time. Less desperate. More final. Then this is goodbye, the Arbiter said. Yes, Vance replied. The connection began to fade, the presence of the human system receding from their view, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet certainty that had defined their departure. But just before it disappeared completely, Vance spoke once more. Not to the Council. To all of them. You'll notice it now, he said. The words carried something different this time. Not warning. Not prediction. Something closer to respect. The difference. The transmission ended. The chamber fell into stillness. No alarms. No immediate collapse. Just a galaxy that now understood exactly what it had lost. And for the first time, exactly what it would take to survive without it. Far beyond their reach, humanity continued forward, not as a replacement for what had been, but as proof of what was possible when a civilization chose to be more than the systems that defined it. And behind them, in a fractured, struggling galaxy, the first real choice had finally begun.